This Seiko 5 isn't remarkable. In fact, I would imagine most people wouldn't even look at it twice. But something tells me that the SNK381K1 might very well be one of the coolest Seikos that you've never heard about. Yes, it took a very long time for me to remember that reference number. Seiko is a household name. We talk about them very often, and most of us enthusiasts know quite a lot about them. Collectability, looking into pieces like the dive watches that have become so successful, their new development of the Prospex line, and more recently the resurgence of the Seiko 5 line. Modern Seiko has become so popular, and there's a reason why they have become so loved as a brand. Not just from an accessibility point of view, with prices that range all over the place, but the sheer variety, the creative diversity that they offer is something that other brands simply cannot. They are very much a superpower in the watch space, and what's even greater is that they aren't a brand that is afraid of making changes, of going in different directions and exploring new creative opportunities. Now, the Seiko 5 is the most successful watch ever produced by the brand. Originally introduced in 1963, aimed to be cheap, reliable, affordable, targeted towards young people, students, and given the name Sportsmatic 5. It was because of this watch, Toru Tanaka, and the development of the movement that we became accustomed to seeing day-date complications on Seikos. Just that alone is hugely successful. Think about how much we pay for day-date watches today. The Seiko 5 democratized this system. The introduction of the crown at the 4 o'clock position, the introduction of the metal bracelet, and the end result, a watch that was accessible, sturdy, automatic, practical, with a day-date feature, water-resistant. Ironically, it was because of this watch that so many pioneering features were introduced to the Seiko Sports lineup for years to come. Up until recently, the Seiko 5 name was seen as nothing particularly special, until Seiko used the name as a rebranding of sorts. The latest move to use the Seiko 5 name to create a new echelon, shall we say, has divided opinions. Very much like how past models have been given the Prospex branding, doubling their prices, so the Seiko 5 name has been added to a new generation of SKX-inspired pieces that, in some cases, have less features and qualities of past designs, and are now priced more. Further we look into the Seiko 5 line, we see a resurgence of field watches, now with different color straps and configurations. These are either themed around pilot-inspired models, others have 24-hour scales on their dials like Hamilton's and Benrus pieces. So what this has done is bring more attention to the Seiko 5 name, front and center. The downside is that going against what made the line so popular, its affordability and simplicity, the name begins to get muddled when it now offers dive watches, some of which lack important features, and this new echelon of tiers to choose from. So that's a brief introduction of where we are with Seiko at the moment. Prices are increasing across the board, whether we look to the Prospex line of watches, some of which are newly introduced, the Seiko 5 collection, many of which are also brand new, an entirely new facelift to some of the models. Pieces like the SKX have been discontinued now in favor of this Seiko 5 branding. It's very simple to understand. Taking the Seiko 5 name, reducing it down, simplifying it, while at the same time making it more accessible, putting it front and center, promoting it, and making people reinterpret what the Seiko 5 name now stands for. The story behind this watch that I'm reviewing is nothing special really either. I stumbled on it one night and remembered seeing the dial somewhere. I couldn't put my finger on it though. It took some time for me to remember back to a few videos that I made in the past, and these were all military videos that I made 1 or 2 years ago. And it surprised me to realize that the dial on this watch is actually affiliated to a very specific set of Seiko 5 models that were available through the 60s, specifically bought by Special Forces soldiers in Vietnam. It's such a strange reference to think about because these modern examples were never highlighted as official reissues or anything like that. Actually, discovering this correlation was an accident, and I don't believe many Seiko enthusiasts have found this relationship either. So in order to understand the origins and the design history linked to this watch, we have to go back to Vietnam. What made Seiko watches so great for the soldiers during the Vietnam conflict? They were cheap, easy to replace, and dependable. Funny enough, if it wasn't for this relationship that the veterans had with these watches, we would never have seen such a huge climb in Seiko popularity in the United States. It was because the soldiers loved these watches so much that they took them home and they pretty much lived with them for the rest of their lives. There were even times when Seiko watches were promoted on the wrists of soldiers in Vietnam as a part of a branding and advertising campaign. Among the many other brands, Seiko were extremely popular choices. The brilliance behind the brand once again showing through that they were able to democratize so many things that other brands charged in excess for. Among the legendary examples of the dive watches like the 6105 and the 62 MAS, many of the chosen watches were typical Seiko 5s. But there also was a selection of 3 references that were chosen and used by the Special Operations Group, MACV SOG, I think we've heard of them before, 2 of which were Seiko 5s. And just like everyone else, the Special Forces teams loved them because they were bright and luminous. What made these models great: full Arabic numerals on the dial, day-date complication, durable, automatic. And another big reason why Seiko watches were chosen by the Special Operations Group was because they were Japanese-made models given to American soldiers. This way you could be unknown and your equipment wouldn't be linked to the United States. A lot of these Vietnam veterans traveled across to Rhodesia. My old man, who worked with some of these Special Forces guys, used to say that they all had a few things in common. They also loved their Seikos. They wore them religiously. The first reference, the Seiko 5 6619-8280. The second reference that came after it, the Seiko 5 6119-8100. And finally, the rarest, one of the hardest to come across today, and many believe that was special batch ordered specifically for the military, the cushion case reference 7005-8030. What is really interesting about the third model is that it used a civilian cushion case. The handset, dial, numerals, that entire layout was entirely unique and only issued on this watch. The first 2 references are quite common, easy to find, relatively speaking. The third one, nobody knows how many were produced. These 3 Seiko references all share a similar design. It's very easy to identify one from the other. And we can clearly see that this SNK381K1 is a reference back to those pieces. It drew its inspiration from the model like the 7005 and the 6119. I find it fascinating how this piece has a sense of modernity to it. It's not subscribing to any of the old school formulas. It's not looking at being a reissue. It's never been announced as a reissue model. It takes a lot of the modern DNA that we see with the precursor Seiko 5 models before the brand had this new resurgence, and adds a few dynamic qualities that makes it an attractive looking field watch. The brief specifications, let's run through them very quickly. 37mm in diameter, lug to lug is 44mm. The case height is round about 12mm. It uses an automatic movement, 21 joules. No hacking, no hand winding, quick set date and day. A clear case back, matte dial. It uses a different range of brushing and polishing on the lugs and around the bezel. For all intents and purposes, it's an extremely basic watch, but what truly shines for me is the dial. Every component that you believe might be applied is applied. The Seiko logo and the 5. Every single numeral you see has been applied with a silver framing. The day-date window has a frame around it. The windows themselves are color matched to blend with the dial. The typeface is minimal. It's an extremely legible watch to read, and the lume is fantastic. It lasts for hours. The handset leaves a bit to be desired. I don't know why they went with this direction of using leaf hands. But the overall package is incredible. And what's even better about this experience is if we take into account what these watches would have cost through the 1960s, the late 60s, about $10. We adjust for modern day inflation, and that's roughly what you're paying for this watch today. Where now, through this vast industry that we're in, can we find a watch that costs the same now as it did 50 years ago? It's been a fascinating experience. This little watch has captivated me, and I'll even say that it has given me an entirely new perspective about the Seiko brand. This is the cheapest watch I have in my collection, and for all that it offers, it's an absolute bargain. And before looking to these more popular, newly released models, it's incredible to see what the Seiko 5 used to offer, still does offer. These pieces were never advertised to us, but they're readily available. Going back to the design of this watch and looking at the approach with a more modern lens, we can see that it uses a few tricks to make it appear a lot bigger on the wrist. The way that the lugs work on this model, short and squat, very much like modern Oyster Perpetual cases. So in a way it's trying to share this relationship with the cushion case, but then also with a more modern twist. how it then uses the day-date complication looking back to earlier generations of the Seiko 5. The offset crown at the 4 o'clock position, probably one of the most iconic features that defined the Seiko 5 line. So many other features that also help push its identity. Why haven't more Seiko enthusiasts picked up on this relationship? And maybe it's because they are so varied. Maybe it's because there are so many options to choose from that a watch like this has gone unnoticed for a very long time. I can't emphasize this point enough, that this watch has definitely rekindled my relationship with Seiko. And I'm looking at it in a very different way. Not just from a price and affordability aspect, the fact that anyone could own a watch like this, but also simply because it's such a good design. And judging by the sheer vastness that Seiko offers as a brand, it's so easy to miss these little gems. And I think Seiko 5s deserve a lot more attention and appreciation today. Maybe not so much the modern examples, but seeing what has come before and the sheer amount of pieces that you can find for such great prices. Yes, it's good to experience dive watches and chronographs from Seiko, but there's also a lot more in the casual sector. And I constantly find that discovering these watches off the beaten track, these examples that don't attract attention but do have a lot of significance to their designs, this is what makes the journey all the more fun. One of the cheapest watches in my collection, with a great backstory, interesting design influences, now also receiving the same respect. You might have noticed a change in camera quality. It's going to take a bit of practice getting used to this new setup, but I will say that the battery has run out twice. It's almost on the verge of running out again. I've got to learn a few things. It's been over 15 years since I've owned a camera, so quite a lot has changed. It's a fantastic little Seiko. It's crazy because it has changed the way I view all the watches they offer, especially like under the Prospex line, those pieces. I don't know, I have more respect for the Seiko 5. It's giving you so much for so little. And though the better build quality is evident when you move up the price tiers, it's amazing what you can find today and what these watches can do.